Actually today when I was in the foyer, Elder Gomes ran into me and said, we might need a part 3 and a part 4, without even hearing today's part 2. But definitely, I'm open to that because it's a lot of information, and a lot of this information, our students are being taught in schools. I was a student, obviously. I told you before, molecular biology major, medical school. So I've had my share of both living science, non-living science. I've taught environmental science, taught anatomy, physiology, taught biology. But anytime it came to matters of evolution and those things, I always told my students the science says. And one day one student said, Dr. G, why do you say the science says? Do you believe we came from monkeys? I said, no, I do not believe we came from monkeys. I am a Bible-believing Christian, so I believe we were fearfully and wonderfully made. Within my class, I can't teach you Bible, but after school, you're welcome to stay by and we can talk Bible. They never did. But you know, there are two types of science, really. It's observable science and historical science. It just boils down to two. The Bible, disclaimer, the Bible is not a science textbook. So if you expect to go into the Bible and see equations and all that, you won't see that. You won't see Newton's laws of motion, but what you will see is natural laws. You'll see things that when you look at it and you put it together, it actually makes sense when you think about it. And today I'm just going to continue from what we did last time. Last time we spoke about creation, the flood. We talked about what happened after the flood, the evidences of the flood. So today we'll continue with that, and some more of these evidences will be explored. All right? As you can see up on the screen, the title of today's presentation is Hairy Elephants, Giant Lizards, and Bones and Stones. Pretty much woolly mammoths, dinosaurs, and fossils. That's what I'm talking about. And as almost like a teaser for the next one that I will do on genes, you guys familiar with those two dogs there? You guys know what that is? Have you guys been looking at the news within the past 2 weeks? They claim to have brought back from extinction the dire wolf. So 2 puppies, they were born in October. The dire wolf is pretty much a larger version of what the common gray wolf is today. The common gray wolf is a very big animal. A few years ago, our Pathfinders, we went up to Lakota Wolf Preserve in Blairstown, close to where I live now, and they actually had 2 packs of wolves there. Wolves are very big. I've never seen wolves in real life. They're big. They're big creatures. Now, these dire wolves apparently were a good 6 to 8 inches tall at the shoulders, putting them probably close to that height. So they claim to have, a lab called Colossal has claimed to have brought back from extinction the dire wolf. They have found some DNA and took that DNA and inserted it into the egg of a common gray wolf and produced twin, quote-unquote, dire wolves. We'll talk about that when I do genes in our next presentation. All right. So, I want to turn this on. All right, so topics today would be the Ice Age, the fossil record, dinosaurs, and questions. Dinosaurs are probably going to get the biggest chunk of it, maybe about 25 minutes. And we'll have a nice little game at the end with some skull bones to guess the animal. I think a lot of people have different misconceptions about all 3 of these. So today, hopefully I can answer some of those questions. Also, just to stick a pin, I have not physically gone and done research on all of these topics in a lab. But what I have done is use the science that I've learned and use the Bible and use some very good resources, and I'll tell you guys some of those resources at the end. There are a lot of Christian resources out there, Christian scientists who have came up with some deductions based on just using natural science and using the biblical principles to see what things happened in the past. Because at the end of the day, no matter what a scientist tells you, if they were not there, they cannot tell you with 100% certainty that it happened, or it happened the way that it did. All right, remember last time we'd like to do these, so can anybody guess what this one's called, this game? Walking on ice. Okay, that's a nice, easy one. So we're getting into the Ice Age. All right, so most of you children, I see some young ones, you guys probably weren't alive when these first ones came out. The Ice Age, everybody kind of sees from Disney with the nice friendly mammoth and the saber-toothed cat and all those other organisms that were alive at the time apparently and chasing the acorn and all that. So they give you this picture of what the Ice Age was. I'm here today to kind of give a little description of what the world says it is, and then also align it with what could have possibly happened after the flood. Because at the end of the day, if we're talking about an ice age that happened between, or several ice ages, they say, that happened between 300,000 and 10,000 years ago, none of us were there to see that. So we can look at the world's view of the ice age, but today I'll present a different view using scientific principles on what happened or what could have happened after the flood. Again, observational science versus historical science. We use observational science today and use some historical science from the Bible and make our own deductions based on the biblical principles and timelines of the earth being 6,000 years old, not 4.3 billion years old like the world says. So there are three types of ice occurring naturally in nature. One are the glaciers, which everybody's kind of familiar with, those big, tall mountains of ice that typically form on land and slides down and flows. Sea ice, which is frozen seawater, and it's seasonal, so that happens up in the Arctic regions, obviously, and the Antarctic regions, the poles of the earth. And then the permafrost, which is frozen underground soil and water. So in the wintertime, this is why if you drive around, you don't see much people digging foundations for homes in the wintertime as up here. That's because we have what's called a frost line. And in New Jersey, it's about 34 to 36 inches deep where the ground actually freezes. Well, if you go, and we're in New Jersey, if you go further north, like northern Canada and in Antarctica, or down south in Antarctica, or up north in the Arctic, we have permafrost, meaning the earth is permanently frozen. So you can imagine their building codes might be a little different over there. I've never been to Alaska, but it's probably some areas might be a little hard to put basements because everything's frozen. And that's what we have occurring naturally today. This is today's climate in terms of cold regions. That's the type of ice existing on the face of the earth. So the timing of ice formation. Ice had to form after the flood. Why do I say that? Well, before the flood, in the Genesis account, global water coverage, there was no room for glaciers or ice during the flood. Before the flood, a mist watered the earth. That's biblical. Water came up from under the ground and watered the earth. There was water, because in the beginning, the Lord said the Spirit moved upon the face of the waters, and He separated the dry land from the water, meaning land was one way, water was another way. There was no Jamaica, no Trinidad, none of those. Those came up after land broke apart. In some cases like Montserrat and Guadeloupe and some of these other islands, they were volcanic, they rose up from the sea. But islands were not a thing because the dry land was separate from the water. Also, we did not have as much water on the face of the earth. Why do I say that? Because it rained 40 days and 40 nights. When that stopped, water continued to rise on the face of the earth for another 100, up to 150 days. That's in the Bible. It's in Genesis. Where did that water come from? Well, the Lord talks about the fountains of the deep were opened up. So a lot of water came from the sky, so we had water from up top, but a whole lot of water came from the opening up of the fountains of the deep. And we'll talk a little bit about those fountains of the deep today. All right, and the movement and coverage of floodwaters would have destroyed any pre-flood glaciers. So if perchance there happened to be glaciers, which you know it didn't have, the flood would have covered everything. Because remember, the floodwaters persisted. Noah and his family stayed in the ark for over 1 year. We talked about that in the first presentation. Go back and look at Genesis and you'll see the number of days it's outlined. It started rain for 40 days, it crested about 157 days, and the water persisted until more than a year, like a year and a month afterwards. All right? So there were 4 ingredients for an ice age. You had to have some warm water, cold land, or cool or colder land, something to block the sun, and a cold atmosphere. But when we talk about the fountains of the deep, really what we can think of are large fissures or holes. Because if you ever look at a fountain just doesn't come up out of nothing. It has to be a hole that water's coming up out of. So after the flood happened, and we had some large fissures under the water, we, till this day, and this is where we have observable science, till this day we do have active volcanoes under the sea. There are mountains under the sea. Dig this, there are rivers under the sea, and there are also volcanoes under the sea. And some of these volcanoes are active, and some of them are dormant. And some of those active ones, they're consistently breathing out hot air from the core of the earth. The core of the earth has a lot of hot material, molten rock and gases, and it has to have somewhere to come out. And it comes out of these fissures. In fact, some of these fissures under the water produce temperatures in excess of 125 degrees Celsius. That's above boiling temperature. And there are bacteria that actually live in there, incidentally. But that warm, so picture you have a flood, you have volcanoes erupting on the surface and below the surface, and these waters are coming up, and now you have hot water, hot or warm oceans. If anyone, I think all the kids here would have done the water cycle in school at some point. The water cycle pretty much is a phenomenon that occurs on the surface of the water. Water evaporates when it gets warm enough, water turns into water vapor, goes up into the air, and forms what? Precipitation. Precipitation is any form of water coming back to Earth. It can come back to Earth as rain, which is liquid, or it can come back to Earth as snow or ice. So now we have a cold atmosphere with warm oceans. You have water that you didn't have before, large volumes of water you did not have before. Warm oceans, very warm oceans, which you did not have before. Land that's cold and soggy, because remember, all this water now has to come off, and now it receded, and now you have land that would not have been as waterlogged as before. Because another promise God gave after the flood, he said, I will no longer curse the land for man's sake. Prior to the flood, man had it really, really hard. Remember when we sinned in the Garden of Eden, he cursed the ground, and it was really hard to till. And he said he'll no longer curse the ground for man's sake. So now you have land that's going to be more fertile, primarily because you have a lot more water in it. So now you're looking at these four things making, well, the last thing would be obviously volcanoes that are above the ground. When they erupt, they actually send several gigatons of ash into the atmosphere. When Mount St. Helena erupted in the 1980s, they actually, for nearly 2 years in that region, the temperature was actually a couple degrees Celsius lower because the ash was blocking out the sun. I don't know if you guys remember 2 years ago. I remember it vividly. Ash was graduating from middle school, and we were in, so it might have been 3 years, and there was this smoke. Remember that smoke, that mysterious smoke that was around? Do you guys remember it was May, I think it was May, late May, and it would be warm, but then you'd see all of the smoke and the temperature, it would just drop. I don't know if you guys felt that or you looked at it. So you could actually, you're not supposed to look at the sun, but I remember looking directly at the sun. I'm like, oh, I can actually see the sun without glasses, without shades. Again, don't try that. I didn't do it for long. And then the temperature felt very, very cool. Now, that was just from some smoke. Can you imagine ash that's actually sitting in the atmosphere for months and months and months, how much that can actually cool the temperature? Because now the light has another barrier from the sun to warm. So now you have these four things at play here, and this is what is gonna help you form an ice age. Now, the term ice age is really a misnomer because in the realm of science, with the old earth science, they're actually talking about hundreds of thousands of years. We're looking, the ice age from a creation standpoint was more a few hundred years. And the ice age did not cover the entire earth. Let's get that straight. Even by their accounts, it covered the colder regions, which would be the poles, and the temperate regions, which would be like, again, parts of northern Canada, northern Europe, etc. So it was not covering everywhere on earth, one. And then two, we can't really call it an age because an age really more talks about a longer period of time. So we're looking at a shorter timeline, but nonetheless, there was a period of time where there was a lot of ice that was covering some parts of the earth that are now not covered with ice anymore. So Again, we talked about the description of the flood. We have fountains of the deep, supports the catastrophic plate tectonics, which if you look at the plates in the earth, if you ever saw a human skull, the bones that make up the cranium, which is the part that holds the brain in, you can think of that being your, similar to tectonic plates. And tectonic plates move a couple ways. They can either hit each other, slide against each other. So if they hit each other, they usually butt up, and that's how mountains are formed. And we talked about how, for those of you who weren't here the last time, mountains could have formed very, very quickly. So when people ask you, well, hey, you think the flood covered Mount Everest? Well, the Bible said it covered all the high hills of the earth. But we show that Mount Everest could have developed post-flood, because on Mount Everest, we actually see fossils and remnants of marine organisms. So one of two things had to happen. Either Mount Everest was covered with water for marine organisms to be on there, or two, Mount Everest was once the sea floor, which secular science admits, and at some point in history was part of the sea floor and moved up and formed a mountain. And using biblical timelines, it did not take millions of years. It could have happened in a matter of days, months, or even a few years. So that's critical. Again, that's why we got to piece everything together. All right, so we talked about the ice age. In the secular view, they talk about 4 ice ages ranging from about 300,000 years to 10,000 years ago. The biblical ice age looks more like up until around the flood time, about 1,600 years, and then we had the flood. And the creation scientists look at it lasting more for anywhere from 500 to 700 years. So, same concept, shorter timeline. All right? And much of the deserts today were actually covered by green, lush grass. And the tundra would be those areas, again, in the northern parts of the United States and Canada, that's called the tundra. And then you had some of the desert that used to be grassland and forests, and the ice age due to higher precipitation and ground levels. All right? So how did it end? So when the ice age ended, so weather or climate is actually cyclical. Weather and climate is actually cyclical, meaning it's a cycle. It goes up and down, up and down. We had one permanent climate prior to the flood. Now, winters happened before the ice age. So let's get it right. There were seasons. There were seasons where some things would grow differently, but the winters were not as harsh as they are now. How do you know winters were before the ice age? In the Bible, in Genesis, after the flood, he said, as long as time persists, there will be winter and springtime and harvest. So we knew, walking off of the boat, Noah and his family knew that we did have the seasons, all right? But what man, post-flood, didn't know that the seasons were going to change so drastically. So there were 2 big changes after the flood. So you had the temperature and the climate before the flood, which many scientists say the atmosphere was very different. There was way less water in the atmosphere, obviously. Then you had the ice age, and then you had we have the climate that we have now. So just to stick a pin, and this will probably be another presentation, when we talk about climate change, this was the biggest climate change that ever happened in Earth. There will never be a bigger one like this. The next one will be when God makes the Earth new. So when persons talk about climate change now and the glaciers melting, well, think about water that was never on the face of the earth, that came upon the face of the earth after the flood. Now that presented its own challenges, but now obviously with some of man's actions, but also with some of just natural processes, the temperature is changing, and we're having some climate change very incrementally based on something that happened 4,400 years ago. All right, so as the ice age ended, you had hotter summers, colder winters, drier conditions. So now you had more extremes. So you went from, okay, really cold in some parts and some pretty decent areas, and now you have extreme winters, extreme summers. Why would that happen? Well, as that ice would have gone away, so again, this is what we're talking about, the pre-flood and the transitional present climate. I just want to go through these slides because I have a lot to get through. This is just an artist rendering of what's now a desert here, and this is what it used to look like, and now this is what it looks like. So as your ice went away, as the ash from the volcanoes would have obviously fell back to earth, and now the sunlight is getting through better, you would have some harsher temperatures because now you don't have that buffer of, okay, we have a cooler northern region and a warmer central part of the earth, but now everything would have gotten a little more stabilized, but you will have your frozen, your glaciers will still stay frozen, but at the end of the day, we're not going to have as much warm water coming up out of the oceans because now the ocean would have stabilized. And by the way, water has something what we call a high specific heat. So water can actually keep warmth or energy for a long period of time. Once that time period ends, it stays in there, and as the water comes out, then it takes quite a bit to heat it up again. That's why when you put a pot of water to boil, you can put tap cold water, and it takes a little time to warm up. But once that's hot, it will actually stay hot. If you remove it from the burner, it will stay hot for longer than it took to actually bring it from cold or room temperature to boiling. The reason for that being is water can actually hold its temperature for a while. And the Amish people actually discovered this, so they build greenhouses and they put barrels, big blue plastic barrels filled of water. So in the daytime as the sun comes in, it heats not only the greenhouse but the barrels of water. And in the wintertime, those water barrels then emit some heat during the night to make sure that crops can continue to grow even when it's 33 degrees outside. So they're pretty fascinating folk. All right, so the frozen mammoths. So there were some frozen mammoths with some elephants with hair. And why would you have elephants with hair? Science would tell you these elephants evolved. And when we do genetics, we'll dive deep into evolution. But pretty much, evolution says life came from simple to complex. Biblically, life was actually more complex and more diverse, and we have decreased diversity post-flood. All right? The reason being, God created the earth perfect, atmosphere is perfect, water is perfect, plants were perfect. Even after man's sin, the process of death was a gradual one. So that's why man didn't just die right away. That's why Adam lived to be 930 years old. And the antediluvians, which are people before the flood, for the young ones, antediluvians, deluge, flood. So anything or anyone before the flood is referred to as antediluvian. They tended to have longer lifespans, and we had more diversity. The Bible talks of what we call kinds. So remember in the ark, and we're going to segue into dinosaurs in a bit. So when in the ark you had animals, science would say we have all these millions of species. You mean to tell me there were millions of species on the ark? No. There were not millions of species on the ark. There were animals that had the propensity to give rise to different species based on their genetic variation built within their systems at the time. This is why God created one man and one woman, and we have so many races on the earth today. God did not create races separately. Locked up in the loins of Adam and in the eggs of Eve were the genetic propensity to create humans of many different shades, hues, and colors. And when we do the genetics lecture, we'll get into that we're really all different shades of tan. I'm just putting that out there. Just think about that. We're different shades of tan. All right? So these mammoths that had hair on them obviously would have adapted. And adaptations can occur and do occur in shorter time periods. Evolution states that things had to come about gradually from a single-cell organism. But even a single-cell organism, for it to exist, like the bacteria, for that bacteria to move, it had a little tail to spin. That is a very complex thing that science cannot even recreate. So for that mechanism to even come about by happenstance is false. So from the most basic animals to the most complex, we all have a high level of complexity. And when I say we, us, the animals, and all of God's creation. So a lot of these mammals they found were really buried in the upright position because they would have died from asphyxiation, not freezing. Because apparently there were some serious dust storms. And again, this is secular science. The beautiful thing, you can use secular science and turn it right back around on them. And they were saying that mammoths obviously were, at one point they were saying they pre-existed man until they found cave drawings of men hunting mammoths. So now a person cannot produce a cave drawing of something they've never seen. So they had to change their story and say, well, mammoths coexisted with man. which we know because man and animals, land animals, were created on the sixth day. I'll come back to the slide in a second. So here's an interesting slide. We're not going to go into names. All these names are pretty much, they have different meanings in terms of their Latin roots or whatever. What science says, as you start from below, from lowest to highest, these fossils found in the earth represent a time. So they say the lowest levels are the oldest and the highest are up top. What's wrong with that picture? Well, let me give you a nice example. If I had a lake or pond in my backyard, let's say a pond the size of the sanctuary, deep enough, and we had, at the lowest level, we had the nematodes, the worms, dwelling down on the floor of the pond in the mud. They would go down, bury themselves in the mud to escape predators, come up, eat the dead organisms and the poop from the other things and go back down and hide. Then on the floor, you'll have crustaceans, crab, shrimp, krill. They're on there, they're eating the dead fish that may fall into the pond, right? You may have some plants growing on the pond, but also in the pond as well. Some of those plants actually have roots, and they grow from the floor of the pond up. So you think worms, crustaceans, plants, well, bottom-dwelling plants, fish swimming around, reptiles, which like turtles. So you have turtles that would be on the land, they'll come in the water, swim in the water, go back and forth. So you think of all those organisms there in different places, and the birds, the ducks that would sit on the top. If I were to get a big enough excavator and just dump a whole bunch of mud and cover everything suddenly, can I say that the worms gave rise to the crab? I come back later, everything's dried out and I'm cutting through the layers. The worms gave rise to the crab. Or the worms lived there before the birds that we found on top. Or they lived there before the fish that was swimming in the middle. Because something is low at the bottom does not mean, one, that it gave rise to something higher up, or two, does not mean that it lived before the other one. They could have all coexisted. The only difference in terms of the lifeline between fish and mammals are one day, the day they were created. Other than that, there's no difference in terms of the timeline in which these things existed. So when science tells you the worms at the lowest level were evolved or came into happenstance before the mid-dwelling fish, and then before the reptiles, and then those reptiles went extinct, and then the mammals, and then humans last, that's not true. All it is, when you think of it in terms of a flood, in the terms of flood, all you're thinking of is what layer it was buried in. When all of this water and sediments that came across and rushed across the face of the earth, and even water, there were whales that have been fossilized because the whales were buried in this ocean as well. Because remember, this is a very rough event. You can think of all of the natural disasters happening at once. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, I don't know, but definitely earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and tsunamis. Everything at the bottom gets stirred up. If you ever cooked soup and you stirred up a pot of soup, things at the bottom come to the top, and that's what happened during the flood. So you had all these things. When it settled out, it just happened to be the things that were the deepest. Obviously, you'll find them in the deepest regions. And let's go back to this slide here. So some of the things that we find is that, one, there were 40 major animal groups appeared out of nowhere in the bottom of the fossil record. Where did that come from, right? Because they say if everything is gradual and takes millions of years to happen, how could you suddenly have 40 species come up? Some of them still alive today. And if dinosaurs died millions of years ago, how can their fossils still contain soft tissue? In fact, there are videos that show pliable blood vessels in dinosaur bones that they have extracted. And these vessels actually are pliable, and they can actually look at the hemoglobin in the dinosaur's blood. We talked about carbon dating the first time around. Carbon has a half-life of about 5,700 years. So if these animals were existence millions of years ago, their anatomy would not even be pliable and be able to be manipulated. Think about that. You cannot have something that has, if it could, within about 80,000 years, if you want to use their metrics, all of those soft tissues should be rotted away. There should be absolutely no sign of it, but it's there. Birds are vastly different from dinosaurs, even the way they walk. How could one come from the other? They say that birds and dinosaurs, dinosaurs were progenitors, birds were progenitors to the dinosaurs. Again, you can't have that. When leaves die and they shrivel up and crumble, so we do find fossils of leaves. Will a dead leaf sit around 5 million years to be buried perfectly intact? So that's why I say you have to use some common sense. And why do we find trilobites, which are some little bottom-dwelling organisms? You find the tracks of them, and you don't find the trilobites, but you find them higher up in the fossil record. Again, because you find the footprints or the tracks of something down below, and then you find the actual organism higher up, you can't have the tracks and no organism, and then find the organism all the way up here. So when you look at science, it does give you some observational science, but you also have to put some historical and some common sense context into it. So what do rock layers show? So evolutionary geologists say the chalk beds formed over millions of years. Basically, all chalk is crushed shellfish. So if you crush up a bunch of shells, it forms a material that we call chalk. And yet, what other fossils do we find buried in these chalk beds are found today in the continents, but not the ocean floor? Well, you do find that, but then it shows the evidence of sin. So if the earth is 6,000 years old, as a Christian, that's why you cannot align with these views. If the earth is 6,000 years old and you believe that these fossils pre-exist creation, that means death and sin occurred before creation, which makes no biblical or doctrinal sense. So if you're a Christian, because there are Christians who believe in an old age earth, they do not align. Death only happened after sin. And a lot of this death that we see in fossil records happened after flood, which was a result of man's sin reaching to a crescendo that God could not put up with. So when you look at science in the context of a biblical standpoint, things make a lot more sense, starting with the timelines, and then starting with logic of death happening after sin, not pre-sin. All right, so, and hopefully this helps. Obviously, if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, you probably wouldn't believe anything I'm saying here today. But I'm doing this because the world outside gives you a view that's their view. It's not observational, but they use some things they observe today to make deductions in the past. So why can't we use science that we have today, along with biblical context, to make some of those same, our own deductions? And that's the purpose of these lectures. All right. So in those chalk layers, when they looked at it under the microscope, they found dead marine organisms. And these are the chalk layers. So you find it in England. It's called a fossil graveyard. You have fossils all the way through these. This is in England. Again, another view of it. Israel, southern part of Israel, Ireland, United States. You get the picture? All around the world. It's not just in one place. All right, some of these canyons, we talked about these canyons before, they have chalk layers and others. Again, Grand Canyon, USA, obviously, we talked about that before. So now we're going to start transitioning into dinosaurs. All right, so these are some dinosaur and bird fossils. So they looked at these fossils and said, we have a bird, we have a dinosaur. The fossils look pretty similar, so birds must have given rise to dinosaurs. That's the same reasoning where they look at an ape and a chimpanzee and a gorilla and say, these things must have given rise to humans. You see how nonsensical this is? Just by looking at some bones. Now, you could look at some bones and make some deductions about the animal, but to say that one gave rise to the other, that's a stretch, but that's what science does, because no one, according to them, using their timelines, no one is around in these prehistoric times to even see these creatures. So how do you know, for example, that T-Rex didn't eat coconuts? I'm just saying. We know they didn't just eat coconuts because they found fossils inside of their stomachs that had meat. But I'm just saying, how do you know? But they looked at the teeth. But there's some dinosaurs, if you did not find remains of other dinosaurs in some of their bellies, you wouldn't know that those dinosaurs were meat eaters, because they also found some dinosaurs with vegetation in their stomachs. Here's a fossil of a fish called a coelacanth. That's the pronunciation. It looks weird, the spelling, but it's called a coelacanth. A prehistoric fish. A prehistoric fish that lived million years ago, they said. Until in the mid-1900s, they found the coelacanth alive and well in our lakes. So is it prehistoric? Or is it just a fish that they happened to find back in the day? All right? The term prehistoric to me always bugs me. Here is a marine reptile called an ichthyosaur giving birth to a baby. If fossils take millions of years to develop or to be buried, they say fossils is sediment, right? Sand and dust has to cover it, and it gets buried. Either this was the world's longest pregnancy, or it didn't happen over millions of years. This looks like catastrophism. While this thing was giving birth, it was suddenly died and got covered up. Here's a fossil of a fish eating another fish. Again, the world's slowest eater. It took millions of years not only to eat this fish, but to then die and get covered up. And fish, by the way, rot very quickly in water. Very quickly. In fact, the first part of the fish to rot, usually the head falls off, and then the rest of the fish disintegrates. If Kai were here, he would tell you, my son, his fish died in his aquarium. Daddy hasn't removed it yet, but a month ago. You can barely see where the fish was. And that's in an aquarium in a closed tank without any outside interference. So the fact that a fish, a fully formed fish eating another fish can sit there, die, if they died, let's say died mid-swallow, and took millions of years to get covered and looks perfectly fine, you can count the vertebrae, it did not take millions of years. That's catastrophism. This was buried in a flood, and when the flood waters dried out, like we talked in the first lecture, sediments became rock, and now when you open the rock, you find these. That's why we call it bones and stones. You don't find any living material in there. All it is it's an impression of what was there, because the bone has already disintegrated, but it's an impression of the bone. And I call it bones and stone in air quotes, because we didn't only find living organisms that had bones, we found flatworms, which are soft, no bones, fossils. So, you guys ever seen an earthworm? If you, as a kid, you probably killed an earthworm, or you see the earthworms die in the driveway. Barring if a bird didn't eat it or anything, do you think an earthworm can sit around for millions of years to be fully covered and you can get a nice impression of it in the sand? Won't happen. Bees, or wasps, sorry. This is a fossil of a wasp. This is a fossil of a jellyfish. One of the softest creatures around. Not in terms of their aggression, they can kill you or make you really sick. But in terms of pliability, they're very soft. You have jellyfish in fossils. Flowers or lilies in fossils. Flowers in fossils. You get the picture. How do fragile living organisms sit around waiting millions of years to be buried in sediments? All right, so dinosaurs are 1 in a million. All right. Okay, so now we move to the third part of today's lecture, which is dinosaurs, which I'm sure I put it last because I'm sure this is what everybody wants to know about. So you hear all kinds of things. People ask, were dinosaurs real? Were dinosaurs real? Did dinosaurs go on the ark? Well, let's explore some of these. Were dinosaurs in the Bible? Is there any evidence of dinosaurs in the Bible? Do you find the word dinosaurs in the Bible? No. The word dinosaur is not in the Bible, but we'll talk about if there were dinosaurs or evidences of it in the Bible. Anytime you hear dinosaurs, the first thing comes to people's minds, big, giant reptiles with big teeth that can eat humans, crush cars, in the world of Godzilla, crush buildings. Hollywood has really done a number on us, on our mentality and our psyche. Movies like Jurassic Park, the whole series, Walking with Dinosaurs, Godzilla, all of these have imprint certain impressions in our mind of what these things are. Walk in the park. Today, so now we'll make this a walk in the park for you so you can go back to school after the spring break and tell your friends all about dinosaurs. All right, dinosaurs in the Bible. Like I said before, the Bible is not a science textbook. Dinosaur is a relatively new word. It was invented in 1841, meaning terrible lizard. Now, I don't know about you, but all Bibles I know of were invented before that. Now, there are some versions that were translated, but I shouldn't say invented, were written prior to this, and we don't see the word dinosaur in the Bible. For the same reason you see the word internet, the same reason you don't see computer, the same reason you do not see Tesla cars, because those things just weren't around. The word dinosaur was not invented. Does the Bible talk about dinosaurs? The question of dinosaurs and the dinosaur's place in the Bible is a common one. We're going to use some biblical history to understand evidence, scientific. We'll use some secular and biblical, and we're going to use some data, fossils, etc. And the difference lies in their starting assumptions about this unseen past and some wrong assumptions which led to conclusions that now we have to live with or we can actually question. So let's talk about dinosaurs. All right, so I just told you that. The Bible was translated into English, into the KJV, 1611. Obviously, we know the Word of God existed prior to that, but this is where King James and they got together. All right, we know the whole story of that. But the word dinosaur was invented in 1841. That's why you won't see the word dinosaur in the Bible. Let's get that right. It actually means terrible lizard. But there are folklore and cave drawings. So not just folklore, not word of mouth, just cave drawings and evidences that man saw these terrible beasts, dinosaurs, dragons. Is the word dragon in the Bible? Is it? Okay. There's actually a dinosaur, quote unquote, today that's called a Komodo dragon over in Asia and Indonesia and whatnot. So there have been dragon stories all over the planet from people who were separated by water for hundreds of years prior to internet and travel and fast travel. You find these stories and cave drawings all over the world, which tells you at some point all over the earth, people and dinosaurs coexisted. All right, so that's a big clue. You look at some cave drawings. All right, the native Indians were drawing the dinosaurs. So that's actually the picture of the cave up top. And this is an enhanced, the picture just kind of, they cleaned it up so you can see it. That doesn't look like anything other than one of those big plesiosaurs, or one of those large land-dwelling dinosaurs that ate vegetation. Here is Montrose County, Colorado, in a cave. This is a Triceratops drawing. So again, you see drawings of people, and you see drawings of what looks like livestock up top. So they know the difference between a Triceratops and a regular livestock. Cambodia, built around 100 years ago, the Temple of Khmer has the Triceratops again there in its logo. I don't think people just made this stuff up. This was before they started digging fossils up. Since then, they've dug fossils up, and they've actually found a lot of these drawings. They've found bones that represent some of these animals in existence. Native American again in San Rafael in Utah. Here's an enhanced drawing of what looks like a flying dinosaur or flying dragon. Again, here's another cave drawing. So you get the picture? All right. This is a Stegosaurus, so this is one of those. And dinosaurs are fascinating because their bones, they pass so relatively, quote unquote, recent and so close. Remember we looked at the fossil record, how high up, quote unquote, in the fossil record they were? So not only do you find their impression in stone, you actually find the literal bones. Their graveyards out in western United States, 6-7 miles long of just dinosaur bones. Just there. Here's another one, another dinosaur fossil or skeleton. Again, here's some more. Here's a big, what looks like the jawbone of a dinosaur. All right, so, and this is where modern science and modern news kind of gets into what I call fake news. So, here we find an expedition finds mass grave of young dinosaurs. Apparently, reckless adolescent behavior has been around a lot longer than people realize. As a matter of fact, it has been around a lot longer than people. Look at that. This is NBC News. Look at what they're saying, or CBS. Look at what they're saying about these young dinosaur graves, all adolescent dinosaurs. And I'll give you my interpretation or what modern creation scientists think. Apparently, reckless adolescent behavior has been around a lot longer than people realize. As a matter of fact, it has been around a lot longer than people. University of Chicago paleontologist Paul Sereno says that one of the lessons of some of the recent fossil finds in the desert regions of China. Sereno says a large group of pre-adolescent dinosaurs died en masse around 90 million years ago when they ran into the mud hole, sinking to their doom. Did they run into a mud hole, or were they possibly buried by a flood? Just think about it. Many of the 25 individuals recovered were so perfectly preserved that their last meals could be identified. 90 million years ago, and their meals were so perfectly preserved that it can be, like, just reading those two sentences together should give you pause. How could something that died 90 million years ago have their meals perfectly preserved and identified? Serena is scheduled to give, so blah, blah, blah. So one of the things that happened, especially here in the United States, in western United States, I like to call them the big square states, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, there's a large swath of areas that we find dinosaur graveyards. And a lot of those graveyards, they find the adolescent or juvenile dinosaurs in them. Why is that? If there was a catastrophe and water was rising quickly, or the tsunamis coming across the land, first off, reptiles are not really known to take care of their young the way mammals do. But they kind of, once they're young, they stick around the parents for a while. Like crocodiles will even transport the young ones from the banks of the water into the water in their mouths, and they'll stick around their moms for about 3-4 weeks until they can start eating. Because we know crocodiles do not, and dinosaurs, they all come from eggs. They do not nurse their young. They do not have mammary glands. That's why mammals are called mammals, because they have breasts or mammary glands. But they would take a little bit of care of their young. But when stuff hits the fan, they're out. So the bigger dinosaurs, stronger ones, could possibly run and go to higher ground to get away from the rising waters. And these young dinosaurs that are in their nests or in their little groups, they stayed and died. So they literally found, not only in China, in that article, they've found many graveyards of dinosaurs where young and juvenile dinosaurs died together. And that's probably the thought process. And to me, and if you're a Bible-believing Christian, makes a lot more sense than this, what we just read here. Here's another, this is one of a pagan vessel showing two dragons and dinosaurs interlocking heads. And this man, Carl Sagan, wrote a book. And his book says, no, dragons and dinosaurs did not exist. To explain the cave drawings, it's just that people remembered them from the Garden of Eden and just some kind of memory they had, and because of that memory, it was passed down throughout time and they drew them. Again, when you look at the world, a lot of stuff doesn't make sense. Psalm 74:13 says, "Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters." So Psalm and Job are two powerful books. Like we saw with Psalm in the previous lecture, we looked at Psalm, I believe it was 104, and it talked about how it actually went through the creation story really quickly. It talked about how you set the waters in their boundaries, and they went above the mountains, and then you return them back to the depths, never to cover the mountains again. I mean, he's talking about the flood in Psalms, and here they're talking about dragons, all right? Job 40:15, "Look now at the behemoth, which I created along with you. He eats grass like an ox." Okay, so what is behemoth? "Behold, the strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly." Be very careful when you look at footnotes in the Bible. The footnotes in the Bible, that's man's interpretation. The Bible is God's word. Some footnotes actually tell you it's a hippopotamus, because they have a big belly. Some say it possibly could be an elephant because it has a big belly. "His tail swings like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are close knit." This is an extremely detailed description of this animal. On the left is an elephant, on the right is a hippo. Do those tails look like cedar? Cedar trees? What about this animal? This is the artist's rendering of one of these sauropods, which you have the Brachiosaurus, which are these tall dinosaurs that were about 80, 90 feet tall, some of them 100 feet long. That tail looks like something that can sway like a cedar. All right. This just gives you some reference how big, and these were bones and fossils that they actually found. So again, we don't know what these things look like, but if you form some flesh around the bones, you can kind of get a picture. These were massive, massive creatures. All right, you look at a bus, a school bus, you look at a giraffe, an elephant, and a man. That's the size of these, but they ate grass like an ox. And they did show, and based on some evidence, they found that these actually were grass eaters. This is a cast. So it's a model, but it's a scale model of one leg. His bones are tubes of bronze, not literally, but it's like, and his limbs are like bars of iron. That's the leg of a sauropod. So obviously, we can throw away the idea of an elephant, throw away the idea of a hippo. We're talking about something different. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring him near his sword. Meaning this animal, nothing else could kill that except God's willing. That's a big creature. Huge, massive. Can you pull Leviathan? This is a different one. Can you pull Leviathan with a fish hook? Any hope of subduing him is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. His sneezing throws out flashes of light. His eyes are like the rays of the dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from his nostrils. His breath sets coals ablaze, and the flames dart from his mouth. This sounds like a dragon. It's in the Bible. I didn't make it up. So when people tell you dragons are mythical creatures and Hollywood portrays them and they say, oh, no, they didn't exist. But can an animal breathe fire and smoke from its nostrils? Some footnotes say it's a crocodile, that Leviathan. No, it's not. That description we just got was not a crocodile. The only thing I can see there is probably some greenish eyes, but other than that, crocodiles don't breathe fire. And yes, you can catch these with a fish hook. They do it all the time. Leviathan sounds like some large reptile that was in the water. And in fact, we do have some fossils longer than the size of a bus that kind of look like these that could possibly be. I think these are these are the plesiosaurs. So the sauropods were the big one, the behemoth. So this could be a plesiosaur. Anybody ever seen this little beetle? Something similar? It's called a bombardier beetle, about an inch long. Kids, if you ever see it, stay away. They're placid, they're very placid, but if aggravated enough, they have a chamber in their abdomen that can mix two different chemicals together and emit near boiling temperature liquid that can burn your skin. This actually happens. So when you think of can an animal breathe fire, well, you got animals that are alive that's shooting hot acid out of them. Here's a firefly. I know we've all seen fireflies. They're everywhere. Back in the islands, here in America, they actually practice what's called bioluminescence. It means that they have a chemical inside of their bodies that creates light, and this light actually is created so efficiently that it does not, they do not expend any energy to create it at all. No, 100% efficient. Wouldn't that be great? We try to mimic that with LED lights. We're not quite there yet. Nature has this. Scorpions with a sting in the tail. They're animals that walk around with poison inside of them that they can inject into other animals to kill them. There are some, this is called the pseudoscorpion. The pseudoscorpion does not have a tail, and just a quick science lessons. They're part of the arachnid family. They have 8 legs. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4 on each side, and then the claws are actually part of their feeding parts. So if you look at a centipede, the centipede has like sets of feeding parts that move back and forth. The scorpion, the outer parts are just a little bigger. They have claws that they can grab their prey and pull into the mouth. So essentially the claws are part of their mouth. This little bugger shoots acid out of his tail that can cause severe burning to the skin and eyes. That's me holding one. If you want proof, that's me holding one. So yeah, I was shaking, but the lady assured me, only if they're aggravated. and I kind of brought it close up to get a picture and then put it back down. But the most scary bug I've ever held. Electric eels, fish that can emit 600 volts, that can shock you to death. So why am I doing this? We saw in the Bible, there was a description. You see, people can tell you things and make you think that dragons aren't real. And when the Bible describes the devil as a dragon, God must have wanted people to know how immensely terrible of a being he is, because those people then would know what a dragon was. And I'm trying to show you guys this because there are different animals that have some things that this eel can actually light up a bulb. It can light a bulb up, the amount of electricity they have in them. Cobra snakes, a spitting cobra that can actually spew venom not only from its teeth, from glands in its mouth into the eyes of an animal. Usually they reserve this for the animal that they're trying to get away from. Because obviously if they sense a threat and something's going to kill them, they want to like spray it in the eyes of a lion or a bigger cat or whatever's hunting them. That's what they do, and then they can slither away while the animal's left trying to clear its eyes out. All right, we're almost done, so stand by me. We're almost there. All right. So I showed those different parts of nature, and there's much more. I wanted to show that there are some really fascinating parts of nature that we can't completely comprehend. However, because we've never seen a fire-breathing dragon, we don't believe it. I'm sure some of you are sitting here saying, nah, that can't be real, even though it was described in Job. But I'm asking you to open your eyes a little bit this evening. So when we talk about dinosaurs, they were in the Bible. We just call it by a different name. Oh, by the way, before I get to this, I didn't put it up there. Many people ask, did dinosaurs go on the ark? Yes, because the Bible says 2 of every kind. Does that mean every single species was on the ark? No, because remember, kinds, and when I do my genetics lecture, kinds are really a group of an animal that has, you might have a small group, maybe 3 or 4 pairs of animals, and locked up into their genetics is the propensity to produce many more different types of animals. So, and also, God didn't say, I will take 2 of every species and 2 adults. Could he have said, oh, let me send 2 sauropods this size into the ark so they can grow afterwards and then mature and then create young ones? Also, the pre-antediluvian world, because of all of these animals were way bigger. You had a different atmosphere. You had much more diversity of plant life, much more diversity of animals. When you took one species in post-flood, that could not necessarily have been all of that particular species. Well, sorry, one kind. You can take one kind in that can give rise to different species, but also there's a big difference between mammals and reptiles. If I take an elephant, an African elephant, and took it into the zoo, fed it enough and gave it everything it needs, a male will become 13 feet tall, 10,000 pounds, guaranteed. If I were to have a T-Rex, and I took care of it, and was able to feed it, as long as that T-Rex is alive, it will continue growing. Reptiles grow as long as they're alive. They're not inhibited by a genetic gene that says shut off, stop growing. Reptiles are only inhibited by food source and the size of their environment. As long as they have a big enough environment and enough food, they can grow for an extended period of time. So that's a big difference. That's why you can find Nile crocodiles that are adults in Africa that are about 8 to 9 feet, and then you have some big ones that are 21 feet. They're all adults, but just some are older than others. They just keep growing. Does shape of teeth always indicate diet? Remember I asked you earlier, like, if you ate, could it be that T-Rex ate coconuts? Well, before sin, nothing died. So if all these animals were there, then they must have all had vegetarian diets, including the lion. In the earth made new, the lion will eat grass like the ox. So, does the shape of teeth always indicate diet? Based on my trying to give you some critical thinking, I'm sure by now you will know what the answer is. Okay, let's play the guessing game. Does this animal eat meat? Go ahead, just say. Does it eat meat? Anyone? Yes. What animal do you think it is? Crocodile. Okay. Crocodile, alligator, yeah, it's a crocodile, all right? And we know crocodiles eat meat. That's a given. I had to give an easy one to start. Does this animal eat meat? Okay. What animal do you think it is? A what? Gorilla? It's a giant panda. They eat bamboo shoots. Part of the family of bears does not eat meat. Look at those canines. Doesn't mean if you encounter a wild one, you go pet him, because he might bite you out of a defense mechanism, but he's not going to try to eat you. They eat bamboo. What about this? Does this animal eat meat? Yes? Okay, what is it? A what? He said piranha. This is a lion. So the lion, obviously, they eat meat. Incidentally, when lions kill their prey, what's the first part they go after? After they choke, they bite the neck. What's the first part they go after? The belly. They go after the belly of the ruminant, which are animals that chew the cud, and they proceed to eat all of the grass, like the entire stomach. They eat the stomach first. So it's almost like let me have my vegetables before I have the meat. All right, this one I skipped. That was my bad. That was a grizzly bear. I flipped it. But that's the skull of a grizzly bear. These got flipped. Polar bear. So I wanted to show you all the bear skulls, how similar they were. Now this one, what does this eat? Sounds a monkey. Okay, what does it eat? Plants. All right, this is actually a gorilla, and they eat plants, fruit, bananas, etc. What does this eat? Well, what is this? What do you think this is? Huh? Somebody said snake, dog. It's a fruit bat. And as the word suggests, what does a fruit bat eat? Fruit. So this little critter is not a meat eater. All right? So you see the sharp teeth and you think, oh, that's got to eat meat. What about this? Shark. Anything else? Fish. Does it eat meat? No, it's one of the few vegetarian lizards around in the earth. So you see when you guys laugh, but you see when science looks at bones and they make these assumptions, how it can be observational science versus lived science or historical science. What about this? Does this eat meat? The second one was an iguana, but that other one was one of the bears. I went out of order. But this is an iguana. Iguanas eat fruit, grass. They're not meat eaters. And right and left here, do these eat meats? Two separate ones. The answer is yes. So you have T-Rex, and the next one is the Komodo dragon. They eat goats and whatnot. Yeah, I know it's a little brutal. Let me skip all of that. All right, what's this? What does this look like? Is this real? Not real. What's that? Hold on, what's that, sis? AI? What is that? Photoshop. It's not Photoshop. That's not my son's skull, but all toddlers' skulls look like that. Why is that? You have two sets of teeth. Remember, you have the baby teeth. So after, as a baby, you don't have teeth. But as the toddlers start to grow, so all these little ones run around here, if you took an x-ray, that's what their skulls will look like. They have teeth getting ready to come down and teeth that are already there. So that's why I put my son, of course, he's missing a couple. So his x-ray will look a little different. But I wanted to show that to you. Like, if you don't understand something, you'll always make wrong assumptions about it. Right? So this is the skull of a baby, well, not baby, of a toddler, a young child. And that's how you know, because they have 4 rows of teeth, 2 on the bottom, well, 2 in the skull, and then 2 in their jaws. Never knew that, right? All right, any questions? Any questions at all? I mean, it could be from what I did before. I'm pretty good on time, 1 hour and 18 seconds left, but I'm good. Yes? What's that? Why is the human skull so big? The human skull, good question. The human skull is so big because we have big brains relative to the size of our bodies. We do have larger heads and we have larger brains. God gave us a large brain for a reason, because he wants us to be able to think, make deductions, memorize. This is why, oh, my phone's over there. My phone has 512, gigabytes. After that's filled up, I have to put a memory card, which you can't do anymore because they want you to pay for storage. So I got to pay for storage, right? Computers are limited. The gaming computers have these big processors in them. You'll never hear the human's brain fills up. Why? Because as long as we're open to knowledge, as long as we are in our right mind, as long as we are not taking drugs or things that can alter our thinking, we can continue to think, process, make decisions. There's no camera out there that's better than the human eyes. I challenge you. I take pictures all the time, and when I look at the picture and I think of where I was, like, the picture does not do it justice. They try. And it gives you, like the picture I showed of the canyon before, the pictures can look so good that you can say, oh, this looks real, I wish I were there. But you have to actually be there to see it. All right? And also, post-flood, not only did God shorten our lifespan, but by shortening our lifespan, it shortened our experiences. So by shortening our experiences, our knowledge base got shortened. So we do have big brains for a reason, because can you imagine the knowledge that Noah and Seth would have had living 930 years? Enoch, who never died, who is up in heaven now, who's been alive since forever. The amount of knowledge you can have being around that long is ridiculous. That's why when man sinned, you didn't die right away. When man sinned, the act of sin precipitated an act of God to take life from us. Because he said, I will remove the tree of life, lest man eat of it and live forever. So if he left the tree of life there, every person who was alive would still be alive sinning. Imagine, unless they got murdered or something, but they would be sinning and sinning and sinning forever. So he actually had to pull the tree of life from us. But thank God in the earth made new, he's going to restore the tree of life that we can feed off of and keep us living. And the reason for that, I think, I could be wrong, but God wanted us to realize that we in and of ourselves are not the ones who cause ourselves to live this long. I'm going to give you the tree of life. You eat of this tree, and that gives you life. So that, to me, when you read the Bible critically, there's some things you just read over and you just don't think about it. So it's the act of sinning caused him to block the access to that tree of life. And he literally said he put two cherubs with flaming swords to block the way to the tree of life, so that man wouldn't go and eat of it. So now, what happened? So when we talk about genetics, we'll talk about the kinds. Whatever that constitutional energy that God gave us from the beginning caused man to live for hundreds of years. Even Noah lived 800 years. Caused you to live for hundreds of years, even after that far from creation. But then after the flood, man's lifespan was shortened. Good question, Brother Philip. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. One time only. So those middle teeth, the ones in the jaws, they get pushed out, and those are the adult ones growing. So these young ones here, the adult teeth are growing in the jaw, and when those milk teeth, we call them baby teeth, get pushed out, the adult one grows in, and that's it. You're not a shark. You lose them after this, you got to go to the dentist. But and then what happens to the spaces? That spaces gets filled in with bone. And it's a gradual process. This takes a few years. So as the teeth get pushed out, the new teeth on the bottom, so the ones up by the nose bridge and the one by the chin, those are the adult teeth. That's the teeth you have right now. Got it? You got it? You see, you don't see it, so you don't think about it. So when for that tooth to come out, well, in the case of my son, he had something with a blood vessel, and so he lost his early. But for that tooth to come out, the new one has to grow and start pushing it out. So that's why typically, as soon as that one pops out, that you see the tip of the other one. And that's what happens. And then the spaces in the jaw just gets filled in with bone, spongy bone, and then that's it. And it hardens.
So you're saying that each of
We're like that, except these. They are like that now, but all of us used to look like that. Not right now, because we're adults. So if you look at an adult skeleton, you'll only see the teeth and the jaw. Put in your phone, Google toddler x-ray. Go to Google, type in toddler x-ray, and you'll think you're looking at an alien. I swear. That's what it looks like. Yes.
So, is that the reason why some of us have double row?
No, that's not the reason why. No. The reason could be is that you just happen, the teeth didn't grow in proper alignment. But the double row is not like a second set of teeth. It's just one tooth getting pushed out of alignment of the other. All adults have 32 teeth, but kids have less teeth. But that's the reason why. Yeah.
I remember when I was young, I had all at the bottom, and then there were other ones.
So the new ones are probably just pushing out earlier or more. Like I said, in the case of my son, he lost his old ones early, so he's going to have like another year or two of a gap. But yeah. Any more questions other than the toddler skull? Yeah, go ahead.
Before the flood, man used to grow very tall. Animals used to grow very, very tall.
Right.
So in terms of the dinosaurs and the Chinosaurs,
Yeah.
I thought they existed. They existed.
They existed, absolutely.
It's just that over a period of time, just like that was like the very height and age of one.
Right.
It shrink after a while.
Right.
There are some people after they get old, sometimes their bones shrink.
Okay. I'll tell you what happened there.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll address a couple of the comments. So let me address the last one first. Older people can shrink because what really determines your height are the length of your bones. And the ones that can decrease the easiest are the ones in the spinal column. So older folks can get what we call degenerative disease, or it can be natural degeneration of the bone between the cartilage in the bone and just the disc. They just start getting compressed. And your 24 vertebrae, can you imagine that if each vertebrae lost like 1/8 of an inch or maybe 1/16 of an inch incrementally by the time, if you were 6'2", when you're like 40, 50 years in the prime of your powers and you turn to 80, now you're 6 feet tall, that's the reason why, because you would have lost some due to just natural degeneration of the bone. In terms of the height of man, we knew that they were taller. There were instances in the Bible of quite a few giants. In fact, even though Goliath was a giant, a lot of the Philistines were giants. Today we find tall people, a lot of them play basketball and make a lot of money. We do find tall people walking around, but there were taller people and whole tribes of giants. In fact, when Jacob sent the spies to the promised land, it said the people there, they were like grasshoppers in their eyes. So there were the antediluvians, we did have taller folk, but again, with time, because of man's degeneration, think about it. How old was Seth when he begot his son? I think it was 130 years old. Very old. Like, that was juvenile in their age, you know? So at 130, you still had like another 800 years to live. So they did have a different, again, that constitutional energy that obviously came from the tree of life and just lack of sin. In terms of the dinosaurs, I didn't talk about what caused the extinction. Some people, secular scientists say it was an asteroid. Personally, I think it's just one of the things, just a process of, you have these big animals that need a lot of food and a lot of plants. You come off the ark, everything was dead. All plant life would have been dead except the marine plants. And now the earth has to take time to catch itself back. And I just think by nature, not only those animals, a lot of other animals went extinct that we found in the fossil record. It just means that the earth couldn't support everything because God wiped the earth. When God created the earth, he put everything in place first. He put the trees, the grass, the herbs, then he put the life. The fish and the birds of the air came out, then he put the animals on the land on the sixth day. All of their provisions were already there. When you kept 8 people alive in a boat, and what creation scientists think about 6,000 species of animals, on a ship for 1 year, and he came out, and yes, they did find the dove brought back the olive branch, but the vegetation could not have been that much. All right, and then God allowed us to eat clean animals for meat and whatnot. So you can't imagine, at some point, remember God eradicated the world as we knew it then, but not sin. Sin was still there. And as man started to eat unclean animals, they probably looking at this big 60-foot brontosaurus and say, you know what, this could feed a whole city. And the cave drawings did show that they were hunting dinosaurs, and they showed them with spears hunting them. So they weren't allowed to live long enough in their natural state. And then obviously, as farming, because when God said he was going to no longer curse the ground for man's sake, farming is what really caused the population to explode. Because before that, man would just kind of gather what they can and put together. Again, in the Garden of Eden, all of our provisions was there. When he drove us out of the Garden of Eden, it was a very harsh world. You had to kind of find your food. And after the flood, he didn't curse the ground anymore for man's sake. So now they can actually garden and grow their crops. And that's how, we went after that. But good points about the height of man and dinosaurs. The asteroid thing, there actually is evidence of a large asteroid that did hit the Earth at some point, but it only hit one place on the Earth. And if we had to go along with the shorter Earth history of life, that would mean all of the life would have been wiped out, which we know didn't happen. But according to them, it happened during the Jurassic period. Man wasn't there yet, so dinosaurs were wiped out. That's the worldview of why dinosaurs were wiped out. I should have put that slide up. I didn't think of it. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's very wrong still.
Huh?
That's very wrong because animals being how long after, we don't know how long after animals got created on.
We do know.
The only thing we know is that it's 6 days.
It's the 6th day. So the flying and fish were the 5th day, and the walking was 6th day. We don't know how many hours, but it was the same day.
6 days, right?
6 literal days.
6 days. Then if it's 6 days, then when they said that the asteroids came and killed off all those animals.
Right. All the animals should have died.
Exactly. Man should also be killed because man was
That's why I said it's flawed. I said it's flawed, even though there's evidence of what could have been a meteor that hit a desert out in western United States. That does not corroborate, because with their alignment, they say it hit this time period, and that time period dinosaurs roamed the earth, so that's what killed all the dinosaurs. Makes no sense, because you had dinosaurs in China, you had them in South America, you had them in Africa, there are fossils found around the world, so one meteor on one continent cannot justify that. And again, understanding that all of these animals coexisted at the same time with man, it would have wiped out anything, and there's no evidence of that in the Bible. The only other time that God wiped out man in the Bible is with a global flood, and the next time will be fire, and it'll be an earth made new. Good point. Good points, brother. Anyone else? Kids, come on. All right. All right, so, yeah, okay.
This is how this world is set up right now. The world doesn't have enough space in order to space food for all of these animals to live in.
That's
So basically, after a while, they will finish.
that's a good point.
For space, fighting for space.
So the space, there would have been more space. Why do we know there would have been more space? Because the water has now come and covered a lot of land. Like I told you before, there are mountains that are now covered under the ocean. There are cities like Atlantis the complete cities buried under water right now. So you make a good point there. There would have been much more land. Like I said, pre-flood, the atmosphere was different. So you would have had larger plants, larger animals, better provisions for all of these organisms. But post-flood, all of that got wiped out.
The reason I say that is because even the whale, as it was said, the whale used to live on the land first.
No. Oh, you said they say that. Okay, I thought you said that. Okay. Yeah, no, that's, yeah.
I think I was saying that the whale was the biggest animal on earth until something happened and they started.
No. Yeah, no, they were, that's wrong. They say that the whale was used to walk on land. That's not true. They call the closest relative, the wolf, the killer whale. They said the killer whale is the ancestor to the gray wolf. That is not true. These are all marine dwelling organisms with flippers. They're mammals that live in the sea. They have large blowholes on top of their heads. For them, they say that because they think of evolution, that it actually evolved to live in the water. As if to say this animal just switched over to this species suddenly, and you get me going on genetics here, but they have something called what they call, what's it called? There's a term they have for it, where something just appears in the fossil record, because a lot of people challenge them and say, okay, you say that the apes are intermediates to us. So where are the intermediates from the gorilla to us? Because you say that we started on all fours and went upright. But for some reason, there's some organisms that we can't find the intermediates. And they tell you that a chimpanzee and a human share about 98% of genetics. Well, that's maybe true, but that 2% is a big difference, because we also share 76% of the genes with a banana, and we're way different from a banana. So, and we share about 80-something% of the genetics with mice. That's why they use mice for all these chemical in these labs to develop medications. So you mean to tell me that I'm about 12% off from a mouse? You know, so pigs as well. So genetics means nothing when it comes to the propensity, because things that are as close together like donkeys and horses, they have different sets of chromosomes. So donkeys have an odd number of chromosomes. That's why when a donkey mates with a horse and you get a mule, the mule is now a dead end. The mule cannot reproduce because you have an odd number of chromosomes when they donate. So anytime I hear this stuff, it always irks me. But again, you have to use your creation scientist head standpoint and then look at it from their standpoint too. I always like to put myself in their shoes, but in their shoes, they think of a world that came out spontaneously. They think of a world that came out of nothing, that just a big bang happened, and then life took billions of years. Life went from simple to complex, where God made everything with a high level of complexity, but we have devolved since sin. Our age has gone down since sin. Our lifespan has gone down. Our quality of life, our height, and all other organisms the same thing. So they look at it in opposite spectrums, and we insert sin and a creator in there, and then we get the whole picture. Yes, sister. Absolutely. There's a place for adaptation, and adaptation 100% happens. It just doesn't happen as long as they say it can, and they've shown adaptations, like I talked about the woolly mammoth. So that's an elephant. That's why I titled my lecture, I said hairy elephants. It really is a hairy, larger elephant. And these elephants adapted to colder regions. All elephants have hair. You look at an African elephant, they do have hair on their skin. It just so happens that if they were to live in a colder region, they have thicker fur. It happens all the time with the Arctic animals. In the wintertime, the Arctic fox has a white coat, looks white. The Arctic hare looks white. Why? The hare has to blend in with the snow to evade the fox, and then the fox has to blend in with the snow so the hare doesn't see it. In the summertime, when they sheds that fur and both of their fur gets brown, that's an adaptation, and that happens from season to season. And they've shown that you have other animals that have adapted over time, like the marsupials in Australia. And one thing I didn't talk about in the Ice Age, because one of the questions that people often ask, well, if you have all these land masses that are separated by water, how did animals get from one place to the next? Well, at one point there was what was called a land bridge, which was raised pieces of land that connected the continents, because before, remember, all of the land was one. Then during the time of the Ice Age, you had ice in the frozen regions, and then as that ice melted, sea levels rose. But people have actually seen iguanas actually sitting on rafts going from Guadeloupe to other islands that never had iguanas before. And just sat on like little rafts of wood, and then once they got there, they reproduced. So that's when you look at Australia, for example, you have a lot of marsupials, which are animals that carry their young in the pouch. So the mom's pregnant, she gives birth, and the young, prematurely, they come out and stay in her pouch. Her nipples and her breasts are actually in the pouch, and that's where they get their milk from. So some people think that could have been an adaptation for animals that took a long time to travel from one place to another. Who knows? We weren't there. But adaptations 100% occur.
And what happened? People used to walk on these ice from one continent to the next.
On the upper continent. So I remember the Ice Age, not all of the ice didn't cover the whole earth. Ice was in the colder regions, and man did survive. You had man living there, but you also had man living here. But also, if you look at people who live in those regions today, they live in cold regions, they have more different adaptations. So for example, the whites, Caucasians, they have more of what we call brown fat. Brown fat provides more insulation. I mean, not for nothing. That's why you see sometimes in the winter, they could walk outside in a t-shirt and they're fine, and we got to put on a jacket. It's just an adaptation. And same thing with the Mongols, those who live in up the northern mountains of China. Same thing. They've adapted. Their body has physically adapted. Black people, we have a lot of deficiencies in vitamin D. The reason is most of us came from Africa, on the entire diaspora, all of us, we came from Africa. But in Africa, in the equatorial regions, you're getting sunshine year-round. In the Caribbean, Trinidad, where I'm from, right up in 10 degrees north of the equator, round the year sunshine. So because you're getting sunshine, your body is not as efficient. It doesn't have to be as efficient in converting or creating its own vitamin D. That's why when you come to these colder regions, a lot of us are vitamin D deficient because our bodies, just based on our history, we have not had that ability. Those who live in temperate regions, they go in the sun, spend half an hour in the sun, they get their tan, and they get the vitamin D, and they go home. We have to do a little more, and we have to do better. In the winter, that's why you either supplement or you try to get as much sunlight as you can through a window or something. But yeah, so those are some practical adaptations that have happened just based on regions where people live, and there are tons of others in nature as well. So adaptations is something that happened 100%. Anything else? All right, well, I like giving these talks, so I will, like Brother Gomes left, but I already promised him the next one I'll do is genetics. So we'll do some genes, and genetics is in the Bible. Some homework, go and read up on the story when Jacob, after he took his 2 wives and he left his father-in-law, and there's a whole chapter and he talks about he was breeding different animals, the speckled cow and whatnot. Go and read up on that. There's actual genetics sitting right there in the Bible. The Bible's a beautiful book. So, but we'll talk more about the genetics and whatnot, the dire wolf and everything else. Oh, and by the way, the next animal that Colossal Lab is trying to clone or bring back to life is the woolly mammoth. So they said in about 5 to 6 years we'll have a woolly mammoth baby, whatever. But all right, so I'll hand it over to Sister Reed. I'm done, so I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Griffith, for your wonderful presentation. Eye-opener, interesting, everything you need to know. All right, so we're going to stand for our closing exercise. We're going to sing
Stand and hold hands. Side by side we stand.